This meeting is being recorded.
All set.
Over to Robin.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Robin Weaver, and on behalf of Reform Elections Now, we're pleased that you could join us this afternoon. We are pleased to have Peter Cyrus, our Director of Research for Reform Elections Now, give our presentation today. The topic, as you can see from the screen, is can term or age limits make government more effective? Just a brief applaud, if you will, for Peter. Peter digs into the data. He does amazing detail. His attention to detail is truly amazing. And he puts it in historical context. And regardless of how you may feel about term limits or age limits, I think you'll learn a great deal from Peter's presentation this afternoon. So Peter, thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks, Robin. And I do want you all to know that I am term limited. My term runs out in 2032, so you only have 8 more years to have to listen to me. I apologize. That's just we're strict on our rules here at Reform Elections Now. Okay, so let's see if I can figure out how to go them. So now that Biden has stepped aside, people are no longer talking about issues of tenure and age in our government. We think this is a mistake. Whether it's Biden, Trump, McConnell, Grassley, Pelosi, Clarence Thomas, or Alito, our government is the oldest in the world with the longest tenure. And as a result, we have a large age gap between our population and our officials. Fewer competitive elections as career representatives gerrymander to keep themselves in power. Disengaged younger voters who have half the voter turnout of those over 65. And a government out of touch on issues like AI and social media. And to resolve these issues, I think we need to consider age and term limits. Let's look at the data. First, most global leaders are in their 50s and 60s. Ours are a little older than that. It's interesting if you look at the U.S. House of Representatives, our House averages 8.3 years older than that of any other democracy. And our Senate is much older than our House. Meanwhile, and look at the numbers in the under 40 column, 10% of our representatives are under 40 compared to almost 22% in other democracies. And if you look at, again, at the lower chamber, you look at Germany where the average age is 47.3. I mean, this is a big age difference. Denmark, 45.6. Now, ironically, we also have the youngest population of any of these countries at 38.8. What does that mean? It means that there's a 21-year age gap between the average member of Congress and the average U.S. citizen. In other democracies, it's 7.4 years. In Germany, it's 2.3 years, meaning the people and their representatives are about the same age. In this country, the people are young and the representatives are old. So, and it continues to get worse. I mean, since 1980, the average age of a U.S. senator has increased from 51.7 to 65.3. And the average age of a congressperson has also increased almost 10 years. Now, the Senate, this to me is amazing, has 18 members over 75 and only 2 under 40. The House has 37 members over 75, and only 5 under 35. Now, sorry, I just skipped over too many slides. Sorry. Okay. Now, politicians have created unique ways of staying in office. They gain seniority, have money from lobbyists, have their districts gerrymandered. And when you talk about gerrymandering, I want everybody to understand it's not just the Democrats versus Republicans, or the Republicans versus the Democrats. It's within a party. So in 2001, the Democrats were anxious to protect their incumbents. So they moved some houses. In one case, they moved 13 houses to stop a younger candidate from running for Congress. And in another case, they moved 9 houses so a younger candidate could not run for state senate. So those 2 candidates who were blocked were named Barack Obama and Hakeem Jeffries, which just shows you what the parties will do to protect their incumbents.
Peter, can I just interrupt for a second to
Yeah.
ask? There seem to be a couple of people that are having trouble seeing the slides. Can I just ask if there are any people that are having trouble seeing the slides, if they could put their hand up? Because I'd like to just get a sense of who's having trouble still.
In the chat, it was Eleanor P. And I replied and said, if you could
Yes.
click a few
Yes.
options. Did that work, Eleanor?
No, it didn't. I already had it in that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Peter, I guess we're okay with most people, so let's continue.
We'll send the slides to Eleanor.
And if anyone has a problem, they should
Right.
certainly note it in the chat, and otherwise, as Peter said, he'll provide the set of slides that'll be available on our website.
Okay,
And
thank
the
you.
recording.
We have
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if you look, House members are serving longer terms. Look at the top and see how those serving longer terms are continuing to become a greater portion. And the same thing in the Senate, only, look at the number of over 12 years at the top. Now, some representatives seem to serve forever. This is some politicians who've been in there, who've served for more than 35 years. Well, in just a couple of weeks, we'll be able to celebrate Grassley's 50 years of service. But look at the number of people serving over 40 years. Now, how many people on this call have held the same job for more than 35 years? Well, I'm sure there's some, but okay, next slide. Sorry. Now here's a question I want you all, you don't have to answer on the screen, just think about. What is the longest tenure in Congress for one immediate family? Father, son, like that. 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, or longer. You all have your answers? The answer is 91 years. A congressional district in Michigan has been represented by a Dingell for the last 91 years. John Dingell Sr., 22 years. John Dingell Jr., 59 years, the longest serving representative in U.S. history. And then his wife has been there for the last 9 years. So the question is, how much money could they save if they just, stopped having elections and had, like they have in England, king, this be easier. Now, here's another question. Besides the United States, how many countries have no age or term limits for their Supreme Court? 1, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. Okay. The answer is 1. Only the US and Aruba have lifetime appointments. Other countries either have mandatory retirements or term limits. For example, Australia, Austria, Belgium, England, Japan, India, and other countries have retirement ages at 70 or younger, which would send Alito and Thomas into retirement. Many countries limit the length of service. For example, in Germany has a 12-year term. France, Spain, and Italy have 9-year terms. If those rules were in effect, a majority of the current justices would be happily in retirement. So as a result of having lifetime appointments and no mandatory retirement age, we have the oldest Supreme Court of any developed country. Now, just imagine the Supreme Court as people live longer. According to David Fishbaum and the Harvard Business Review, the average tenure is likely to increase to 35 years over the next century, compared to 17 years over the previous 100 years. So can you imagine what the Supreme Court's going to look like in 30 years when the average tenure is 35 years and the average age is 85? Now, age can be a problem because people can suffer from physical and mental issues. And this is a real quote from a real guy. There was this guy, Mike Kim, who was a pharmacist in Washington, D.C. And he provided Alzheimer's medicines to a large number of members of Congress. And when he was interviewed, he said, hey, at first it's cool. Then you realize these are the people running the country. It makes you kind of sit back and say, wow, they're making the highest laws of the land, and they might not even remember what happened yesterday. So, what's the two last trivia questions, okay? Right now, the current leaders of our country average 75.8 years. If I take away Hakeem Jeffries and Mike Johnson, they average 81.5. How old were the founding fathers in 1776, excluding Ben Franklin? 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. Most people are guessing 60. What's the answer? In 1776, the average age of the founding fathers was 34.1, but excluding Franklin, it was 30. Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence at 33. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay averaged 38 when they wrote the Constitution. Hamilton was 32 when he was appointed Treasury Secretary. You want to know what the biggest problem with the Constitution is? It never occurred to these kids that 235 years later, all those kids would be gone and the government would be in the hands of AARP members. So one last bit of quizzing here. Many of you will probably say, well, of course those leaders were young. Life expectancy in the 1700s was much shorter. But what was the average age at death of the founding fathers? We're going to exclude Alexander Hamilton. 45, 50, 60, whatever. It was 80. Adams lived to 90. Jefferson, who died on the same day as Adams, Madison, all these guys died in their mid 80s. Only Washington died under 70. So that means, go back to the average age in 1776 and the average age now, there's a 51-year age difference between the founding fathers and our current leaders, okay? That means our current leaders would have to live to 131 and a half to equal, and so my thought is, do you really want to see Mitch and Nancy running the country on our 300th anniversary in 2076? Again, just to look at age, the executives of the Magnificent Seven stocks average 54 years old, 37 and a half years younger than our political leaders. Now, the argument for keeping older political leaders is that with experience, they gain wisdom and judgment. But how many times have you heard somebody complain the leaders of Apple, Microsoft, Meta, Alphabet, Amazon, NVIDIA, and Tesla are just kids? We need to get older people running those companies. Now, the founding fathers, even though they were in their 30s, people sort of liked them. The leaders of the Magnificent Seven stocks are very popular, except, when the market crashes. But our government leaders, who are much older, are not doing so well. Interestingly, the public is pretty unified in recognizing there's a problem and that there are simple solutions. Let's look at the approval numbers. Right now, only 16% of people approve of the job Congress is doing. That's, when you look at numbers of 80%, early in this century, even, 40% back in the 80s, and then you look at 16%, that's pretty crappy. And yet, interestingly, because of the way the parties are organized, Congress has a re-election rate of 95%. You would think that if everybody disapproves of something, they would be throwing them out. In 2022, the Senate re-election rate was 100%. And the only people who lost are those like Liz Cheney, who stood up against their party. So why are people with such high disapproval constantly reelected? It's because the two parties set the rules, so there are a few competitive elections. Now, look at the Supreme Court. The beginning of the century, over 60% of the people approved the Supreme Court. Now, and I know the chart ends at 41, but there was a more recent poll that didn't have a good chart with it. But now, according to a 538 poll done on July 13th, the approval rating has dropped to 36%. And you get the same kind of numbers for the president. So with Americans disapproving of Congress, Supreme Court, president, and our political dialogue, it would be useful to look at how they feel about term limits and age limits, both of which could significantly impact the workings of government. And these numbers, to me, were pretty shocking. 87% of voters approve of term limits for Congress. That's 86% of Democrats and 90% of Republicans. Now, I don't know what other issues would have 87% support and support of at least 86% of both parties. That's pretty impressive. What also interesting is that older people like me, are very supportive of term limits. 91% of those 65 to 74, 86% of those over 75, 88% of those over 55. These are people who've watched Congress grow older and more tenured and who understand how long tenures can impact government. And they are also people who have long careers themselves and understand how tenure can take its toll. Now, what about age limits? Interestingly, despite all the talk about age limits, 79% were in favor of putting a maximum age limits for office holders in Washington and 74% for the Supreme Court. And the 70%, 74% picked an age limit of 70 or under, which would eliminate 36% of the Senate. Now, Americans also favor maximum ages. Few argue about maximum ages for pilots. If you get on a plane, a pilot says, "Hi, this is Captain Smith. I'm 86 years old. We're flying from New York to Tokyo. I'm going to have to take a couple of naps on the flight. There's no co-pilot, but I haven't crashed yet, so don't worry." You would say, I don't know if this is the right flight for me. But if you look at the thing, pilots come in first, then members of Congress, then police officers, then federal judges, way above truck drivers. It's like, just throw another number. And if you're flying on a plane and the pilot's trying to call air traffic control and you got a 75-year-old air traffic controller, no, that plane's going to have some issues. Now, term limits are not a radical idea. Obviously, there are term limits for president, which were passed after FDR. But what's interesting is 37 states have term limits for governor. And sometimes, like Michigan, Virginia, the governors move back and forth. The people move back and forth from being governor to being senator to being governor again. That's all fine. 16 states have term limits for their legislatures, usually 8 to 12 years. And 24 countries, as I said earlier, including Italy, Germany, and France, have term limits for Supreme Court justices. So if term limits work for presidents, governors, and other officials, why shouldn't they be more widely applied? Now let's look at the pros and the cons. We prefer term to age limits. We believe tenure is a bigger problem than age, and that some of the older people are still in excellent physical and mental shape, myself excluded. But there is more support, 87%, for term limits than for age limits. We don't need both. Each will help solve the other problem. But for the Supreme Court, both term and age limits will require a constitutional amendment. For Congress, term limits will require a constitutional amendment. There may be some other ways to get around age limits. Let's look at that. Now, one method of limiting the tenure of elected officials, creating more competitive elections, limiting gerrymandering, et cetera, is to have term limits where representatives can only serve a specific number of years. This doesn't mean that when they're term limited, they'll be out of work. You don't have to run a charity, event for these people. Former senators and Congress people rarely have to look for jobs. But it does mean they will not be in their job for life. Just so you can remember, Joe Biden was first elected to Congress at the age of 29 in November 1971. Now, term limits of an appropriate length should have some significant benefits. They should allow office holders to gain experience without becoming stale, lead to more competitive elections as long-term incumbents are forced to retire, limit gerrymandering, reduce the power of money, lead to some younger elected officials, and improve political dialogue as new candidates advance new positions. The challenge is how to balance experience with the cost of having a leadership that's too entrenched. Now, we think, interestingly, some legislatures want very strict terms. In 2023, which was last year by my calculations, Ted Cruz proposed a constitutional amendment with term limits 2 terms for senator, and 3 terms for the House of Representatives. Interestingly, Cruz is currently running for a 3rd term. If his amendment had been passed, he would have been forced into retirement. But Cruz proposed a constitutional amendment term limiting himself. We think that 12 years and 6 years is too short a term. We're recommending 18 years for Congress, 18 years for the House, and 18 years for the Supreme Court. 18 years in each of these jobs would provide a balance between experience and new younger candidates. Now, there are 2 ways to get term limits implemented. Both require constitutional amendments. The first one, a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate, followed by a majority of 38 states, ain't going to happen. The people in the House and the Senate are not going to vote to term limit themselves. But under Article 5 of the Constitution, state limits may create a convention to enact a constitutional amendment supporting term limits. If 34 state legislatures pass such a bill, we can have term limits. Now, before we go to the next slide, I'm just going to ask you all to think about something. If I told you that 10 or 11 states had already moved for this constitutional amendment, think to yourself, how many of these states are blue, how many are purple, and how many are red? In other words, who's more in favor of this, Democrats or Republicans? Okay? And the answer is interesting. 11 states have already acted. 8 states have passed laws calling for the constitutional amendment. 3 more states have passed laws in one of their chambers. 10 of these states are bright red, and 1, Wisconsin, has a bright red legislature. So why do red states support term limits while blue states oppose them? And why did a Republican senator support proposed term limits with no Democratic support? I'm not looking for an answer right now. I'm just pointing out that it's an interesting issue. We'll get back to that.
Peter,
Yes,
can I answer? Can I give an answer?
sure.
For the last 20 years, I have been running it over in my head, basically what you're talking about in different ways. My opinion is that I would like 1 term, and in the House, make it 4 years instead of 2 years.
Okay.
I would double the term limit both for Senate and for presidency. And 1 term, this is not you're here to serve the country, not to have a job for life.
Okay. Hold that thought. We'll
Yeah,
get to the discussion period.
Yeah, maybe just since we started to be interactive, Jean-Louis has his hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Can I just finish? I'd love to hear from Jean-Louis. Let me just finish the few remaining slides, okay?
Okay.
The term limits, in my view, will solve many of the problems. 18 years in the Senate, House, and Supreme Court, more competitive elections, less panic in the Supreme Court over, Roe v. Wade or something, because you know that those people are not there forever, and younger people will not feel as detached from government. Now, age limits are interesting. Again, there are 2 ways to create age limits. Congress can pass a constitutional amendment, which ain't going to happen, so we can forget about that. The states can pass constitutional amendments for their own representatives. Now, as I said, people like Pelosi, McConnell, Grassley, and others, they're not going to force themselves into retirement. But it does appear that individual states have the power to set their own rules. Here's an interesting one. In June 2024, voters in North Dakota, by a gigantic margin, passed a constitutional amendment on congressional age limits. The law bans anybody who would reach 81 before the end of their term from running for the Senate or the House of Representatives. Now, both senators from North Dakota who were under 70 suggested the law was not going to pass. But looking at this way the Supreme Court is ruling in favor of Roe v. Wade and things like that, that's a state's decision. Logic would indicate that age limits would be the same. Now we're going to have to wait and see, but it's interesting that another red state with young senators has become the first state to create age limits. Now, you're never going to have age limits for president unless, you come up with some intellectual test which can disqualify somebody, but nobody's even going to take the test. So let's skip that one. But the question is, why don't we have age limits for Congress and the Supreme Court? Generals and flag officers retire at 64, which is younger than the current average in the U.S. Senate. We're saying, okay, we don't want somebody starting a war. We don't want somebody managing a war for us at the age of 65, but we're perfectly happy for them making all the decisions. As I said, airline pilots at 64, air traffic controllers at 56. What's interesting is that many states have mandatory retirement for their judges. Maryland, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Michigan, and Florida at 70, Oregon at 75. So if experience is if age is an important consideration for generals, airline pilots, air traffic controllers, and judges, shouldn't it be a consideration for Congress? Now, we believe that enacting term limits and age limits for Congress and the Supreme Court will solve some of our problems and give the U.S. a younger, more successful government. For Congress, term limits will produce more competitive elections, lead to a younger group of legislatures. With legislators no longer serving 40 years or more, power will be more evenly distributed. More younger people will have a chance to influence policy and move to leadership positions. With modest age limits, the process will be further enhanced for the Supreme Court. The risk will be to reduce the risk. The benefit will be to reduce the risk of a small group of people serving for decades. These two steps are essential if we're going to reduce the duopoly of the two parties, increase bipartisanship, and align our government with that of our people. Now, here's an interesting conundrum that I raised before. If you look at the chart on the right, what you see is that young people are overly whelmingly Democratic, and old people are strongly Republican. So the question is this: if the young people are Democrats, or at least the 2/3 of them, why are the Republicans supporting the term limits and age limits? It would seem to me that's counter-logical, because if you have term limits and age limits and get the younger people more involved, that should benefit the Democrats. Yet the party of the younger people is against term and age limits, while the party of the older people is for them. So in conclusion, our government needs term and age limits. We have by far the oldest government. It keeps getting older. There are very few competitive elections. The problem is the Supreme Court is bad, and pretty soon it's going to be, they're all going to be 85. And, you know, we've said the most effective way for term limits is for a constitutional amendment. Congress could also pass this. You could have a constitutional amendment for Congress and for the Supreme Court. Age limits, you could have states try to do it on their own. But the bottom line is we need to make our government younger, our elections more competitive. So that's what I have to say, and I will stop my screen share.
Okay.
Okay.
So Jean-Louis had his hand up.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to make a couple of comments on your presentation, Peter. You made some comparisons which are, I think, irrelevant. Talking about a pilot was the responsibility of hundreds of people in the back of him. You certainly don't want an 80-year-old piloting a plane. I mean, that is not comparable because it's a very different type of job. So it's not a good argument. Also, I would say that your emphasis on the Supreme Court does not surprise me. The Democrats and us, hate the Supreme Court because they don't control it anymore. It's the only branch of government they used to control for many years to do their bidding. Now they don't, because we have basically originalist and more conservative justices who apply the law, don't make it as they go. So that to me, and the reason that the approval of the Supreme Court has gone down
Is being recorded.
I'm sorry?
I'm not sure what that was.
The reason that the approval of the Supreme Court has gone down is related to recent decisions which go against the thinking of some people, the Dobbs decision in particular, and a few others which have been controversial. So they don't like, the Democrats don't like it, so they want to basically control the Supreme Court. I don't see the need of an age limit for a Supreme Court justice, to be honest, because the job, again, is very different. They don't have the pressure of re-election. They don't have the pressure, but that's where wisdom is very important. And the experience of having worked for many years on many cases is important. And I think you want thinkers, and you can think until you are, I mean, some people, not Biden apparently, but you can think until you're 90 years old. I mean, if you listen to Richard Epstein on his podcast, The Libertarian, he can talk a mile a minute and is totally coherent and is Biden's age. Okay, so age limit doesn't make sense to me. Term limits, yes, I agree with term limits for Congress. I would want a longer term limits for the Senate, because again, Senate is an element is an anti-democratic element really in the Constitution, which is very important because it supposedly brings more stability and it changes less with time and majority opinions. So I'm not in favor of I would, if you would limit Senate, I would limit 18 years, maybe, that's fine, but the House I would limit to less than that, certainly. Those are my views. Age limit in general, I am not in favor. You say that a president would never take a cognitive test. Well, if it's an obligation, he will, and the results will have to be made public. And if they don't meet the test, they have to leave the job. I mean, but age is not an indication of cognitive ability. Again, it's so I don't approve of age limits in general. Another argument you made, which I think doesn't make sense, if pardon me, is that you talk about, for instance, a thing you don't like, which nobody likes, which is gerrymandering. gerrymandering is linked to, it's not because you have term limit that you would certainly not have gerrymandering. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they would have to change their candidates more often, but they would still do gerrymandering to basically try to get more Democrats than Republicans to vote in particular area. So I don't think it would help gerrymandering by I don't think that argument is valid from my point of view. But you know more than that. You have looked at the problem a lot more closely than I have, so maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, those are my comments.
Okay.
Would you like to take additional questions?
Yeah, no, let's, I see Susan has her hand raised.
Susan Falk?
Anybody else wants?
Well, I agree with what Peter has presented, because I think that we have our government is just much too slanted with older people. And as far as the Supreme Court and whether some people have good cognitive ability at 90, yes, some people do, but there are many people that don't. And I think I definitely am not in favor of the Supreme Court having lifetime, being there for lifetime. I think that that they should be appraised, that they should take cognitive tests, that they should have limits. I think they should have limits. And I think basically I agree that our government is just too old altogether, and it would be much more balanced if there were term limits. So I'm definitely in favor of that.
Then thank you, Susan. Michael Otten.
Well, I just want to respond a little bit to Jean Louis' comment about the importance of wisdom and that comes with age. And of course, that was there was the famous Ronald Reagan clip about his experience. 18 years was the option that was discussed by the Supreme Court Commission. That also was intended not to make it retroactive to the justices currently in the job, to avoid the charge of partisanship. But there was also part of that proposal was to phase it so that there wouldn't be such a grouping of appointments in any particular president's term. I think people that are interested in this should look at that report, which was done by a fairly broadly bipartisan group of academics and politicians, and came up with a recommendation that seemed to be well supported. It does 18 years is a lot of wisdom. But I go back to the old adage about power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely. And in fact, one does wonder as one listens to some of the older justices on both sides of the left and right, they do begin to sound awfully righteous and arrogant in their certitude of the righteousness of their positions. And I think that's not a good thing, and it comes largely from having no limits on their power. So I definitely favor moving in that direction. I don't think it requires a constitutional amendment, but that's something that needs to be tested. Some of the thoughts Peter shared with us can be done at the state level. Some of them need to be done at a national level. I think certainly the constitutional amendment approach is the least likely to succeed. That's the thought anyway. And I think I see G. Lee is next in line.
Yeah, thank you.
G. Lee.
Hi, yes. Good to see everyone. And Peter, thanks for a great presentation. In general, I agree with term limits because just for the reasons that Peter laid out, it's important to have young blood in our government, in all branches of government. I think that for the Supreme Court, if we do have a term limit, that would make the fight on putting people onto the Supreme Court less polarized. And because many presidents probably would have a turn to put somebody on there. So that way I think it would be a less politicized process. And I think also raised the question on why Republicans are for term limits and Democrats. I think it's just, ideologically or philosophically, believe in limited government. Republicans do not want the government to be concentrated on in the hands of a few people. And I think, regardless of whether that's going to, give Republicans any favor in the election, it's just in principle. Republicans believe that the government should be for the people and we should not breed a ground for a few people to be able to control power for such a long period of time. So that's my take.
I
Thank
just
you,
want to, before we call on the next person, I just want to say those are two of the best answers I've heard. And let me tell you what I like about those two answers. Your first point is that that the Supreme Court nominations would be much less politicized because the people are there for a set term, and every president's going to get to, as Mike suggests, get to appoint, roughly the same number of people. And you wouldn't get this kind of stuff that you got, with pushing, the nomination of our attorney general, a current attorney general out too close to the election. And your point about small government, I think, is very important. I think it's right on. And before you call on the next person, I'm standing up, so I apologize. I have one thing that I want to do, so I apologize to everybody. I'm not going to the bathroom, but I want you all to look at this. Okay. This is a picture that the next person.
There's a big reflection on it, Peter.
Well.
Take it off the window and take it off the wall.
Take it off the wall.
Put it in front of your face.
Hold on. Turn off the light. Maybe that'll help.
Tell us what it is. Maybe
is that a better thing? Well, I'll just tell you what it is, and then I'll go back to work. But the next person who's got his hand up is one of the country's greatest living photographers. And that is a picture that he took at the Selma to Montgomery March of Martin Luther King from the back. And it is a really famous picture that, among other things, is in the collection of Sir Elton John. So, okay, Steve, I've buttered you up enough. I hope you have something nice to say, because I've run out of nice things to say about you, and will never again say anything nice. So. Fortunately, he's muted. Steve, are you asking a question, or are you just sitting there looking dumb? Okay, well.
Bottom of the ribbon.
Seems like we have a technical problem getting.
Yeah, he can take pictures, but he can't ask a question. I suggest.
There he is. We got him now.
I got you. I couldn't find the unmute. Okay.
That's why we shouldn't have guys in their 80s serving on the Supreme Court.
That's right.
They can't find their mute button.
Exactly. Let me bring up something from the polar opposite. I have something to said about the older, but I also have a problem with the younger. When I was in college, I was an editor of a city college newspaper, and I watched young people dealing with Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, the Vietnam War, and I developed a high suspicion of the prescience and intelligence of young people. And I personally don't believe that we should go on and lower the voting age. I think it ought to be at least 21, if not higher. I find that young people don't have enough experience. Here you're talking about older people having more experience up to a certain point. I find that younger people don't have much experience, and yet they're willing to vote on important issues that they themselves have not been able to sufficiently entertain or experience. So that's one of the things I think that.
Okay, Steve, let me just ask you one question, then I'll let you continue.
Okay.
Want to put you on the spot. Are you a Republican or a Democrat?
I'm a moderate Democrat.
Okay. And you understand that the suggestion you've made, if implemented, would ensure that Donald Trump was elected in 2020 and that he will be elected in 2024. I'm just, you know.
I understand.
Okay, I just want to make sure that you understand.
The problem I hear about all the discussion going on is everyone is doing their own gerrymandering here with age, depending on how they think those people are going to vote, either for or against, and not in terms of any kind of ideal abstraction. So they say, if they're going to vote for my idea, I'm for them. And, you know, that's the way gerrymandering works. And that's what I hear here. The thing is, I'm looking at it and saying, young people are not always very experienced. Should we allow them to vote? We set lower limits on age, but it keeps getting lower and lower. And I suspect it's because it tends to favor their point of view, not necessarily whether it's well thought out or not, but simply that. So
maybe we should go back to the original system where only white men who owned land could vote. I think that would be, you know, then you're sure of getting smart people voting, and you don't have to worry about this riffraff.
You're saying it wasn't necessarily white men; it was anyone who had property.
Well, but in reality, that meant white men. I mean,
listen. You know, you're bending history a bit. You know, twisting it a little bit. I understand. Anyway, the question of age is. I understand the problem there, and I don't think really age is the question. It's really competence. And what kind of rules can you set up that will be reasonable? Should we have age? Well, the point is, if you have an upper limit for age, people will stay there as long as they can, long beyond their expiration date. And we see that with even our present officials. Should we have a number of terms or anything that would limit that? Yes, I think that would be reasonable. And we pay a penalty. That means when we have very good people, they're going to be leaving. But perhaps that's still a price we have to pay.
But you live in California.
Yes.
You had a senator, Dianne Feinstein, who for the last part of her career, I mean, did you watch Dianne Feinstein in the last part of her career?
Listen, Dianne Feinstein ought to have retired long before, as Biden, as all these others, when they begin to show their age. Yes, I believe that.
And when was the last time name one candidate who retired when he or she started to show their
Of
age.
any party, McConnell, everyone, they all want to stay in power. You know, it is the ultimate.
Nancy Pelosi,
Pardon me?
Nancy Pelosi.
Anyone.
Well, she managed to not retire, but certainly reduced her role, and largely because of her age, I believe.
Well,
She didn't
some
reduce her
people-
role. She
some people
reduced her
do-
title, not her role. If you watch
Yeah.
who's calling the shots for the Democrats.
Yes, yes. I see Robin nodding vigorously.
Power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. And, you know, Lyndon Johnson knew that. And so should everyone listen to those words. No matter what political party they want to
But
hold on.
the question I raised, and we'll get to Paul. The question that I raised is very simple. Why are we the only country with basically no age or term limits?
We had an informal, don't forget,
Steve,
George Washington.
Steve,
Don't
okay.
forget about George Washington. He set a standard that was kept for many years. About
I understand, but
that was informal because he said it.
Yes, I understand that. Let's go to the next person, Paul.
I just want to remind everybody that you don't have a great problem with lower age limits, because we have limits. I think isn't it 30 in the House and 35 in Senate, and the president 40?
No, it's 25 in the House.
25 in the House,
30 in the Senate, and 35 for president. And just for the record, when Biden was elected to the Senate, he was 29. It's not the date that you're elected, it's the date you're inaugurated.
Right,
so
that's the important.
So Biden got to be 30 between the time he was elected and inaugurated. But you're correct, we have lower age limits. And the guys, I mean, the people who wrote that law, like Alexander Hamilton, you know, he was too young. He wrote a law and he was too young to to get elected to the Senate.
But I'm comfortable with those limits if we're talking about that. And I really don't have a problem with 18-year-olds voting. I realize they don't have the judgment of 40-year-olds, but it doesn't bother me. I think getting them into the system, getting them thinking about politics, is beneficial. The other point I want to make is completely different. The Supreme Court, and judges in general, I have, as a retired lawyer, have strong feelings about that. I would want our judges generally to have as much experience before they became judges. It's quite different from Congress. I think that they need to have a lot of experience about the subject of law, and not the broad areas that we ask our Congress and senators and presidents to deal with. So I really I'm not comfortable with a judge, especially in the federal court where the cases are substantial generally. I'm very uncomfortable with appointing judges under the age of 40, for instance, to the trial courts. And probably in the Supreme Court, I'm quite comfortable with 50-year-old judges. Now, the question of the upper age limit or the term, say you did the term rather than the age. The reason we don't have it is that we're very worried about pressure on judges. And that's why we decided that they shouldn't have term limits. So nobody can say, you know, you're getting toward the end of your term, and pressure them in some way to reach some result, I suppose, on that basis. But maybe because people are living so long now, maybe we do have to think about something like 20 years on the theory that by that time, most of the Supreme Court judges, for instance, will be 70 or a bit over 70, and maybe that's enough. So I've said my theory, my thinking about this. I have to tell you, we have term limits in the state government of Florida, and they don't seem to make an impact at all. That's a little different from the federal, because what happens is the 8-year term is over in being a county commissioner. So what do? Since in southern Florida, southwest Florida, the Republican Party controls virtually all the elections, you just switch over to another office, and then you get another office. It doesn't take you out of the system. So it hasn't resulted in newer faces. Generally, it's just sort of a rotation, often, of the same faces in different offices.
I want to
Then,
respond before we go on. I want to respond to you, Paul, by looking at something that Jay Lee said, which which is fascinating to me, which is because the two parties are so divided, and they know that candidate, that Supreme Court justice, will have a huge impact on, policy for the next so many years, that what started to happen is they've been appointing much younger people. I mean, if you look at the age, of, contend that Ketanji Brown Jackson was 50 when she was appointed.
Kavanaugh,
Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, all these people, they're appointing. If they look at two judges, and one is 65 and has great experience, and one is 48 and has limited experience, but they both have the same politics, they're saying, oh, let's appoint the younger person because they'll be there. I mean, according to that Harvard Business School Review article I cited, it said Gorsuch could, based on life expectancy, Gorsuch will serve 49 years for 9 presidents. And the point, the interesting point is, if there were term limits, you'd go for instead of looking politically who could live the longest, you'd go for who the best candidate was.
I just want to thank you. I want to bring in David Cliff. He doesn't have his hand raised, but he's asked a question in the chat. Okay. David, would you like to ask the question? Or would you like me to?
I can. I'm sorry, my video isn't working and I can't figure out how to fix it. So I'll assume I'm getting through. But, basically, yes. To me, the issue is very different between Congress and the Supreme Court, because Congress has to run each, 2 years or 6 years. So what's the matter with the argument as a democracy that says, if we don't like these people, we think they're too old, we'll vote against them? And I know there are lots of other problems and whatnot, but the core issue is I should be able to vote for who I want, and I should be able to evaluate whether somebody's too old or not. I wouldn't have voted for Diane. She was too old. I wouldn't vote for Mitch. Those people wouldn't vote for Mitch. So I think that you have to separate the two. And I'd like to have some more discussion around the constitutional amendment, because that's what this discussion is about. We can all say what we wish we had done if we had been sitting in the Constitutional Convention, but we weren't there. And even if we were there, they might not have listened to it. So, to me, the idea of getting around the Constitution by doing something at the state level assumes that the guys sitting in the Supreme Court are going to let you do that. So it all comes back to, how do you think even the people in this room representing, by the way, we're not at all representative society. How would us, how would we agree on a constitutional amendment? And how do we think that, the country at large is going to agree on the kind of constitutional amendment that would be required? So then we could talk about whether it's 12 years or 18 years, or because that difference isn't going to be what decides whether we can get a constitutional amendment done or not.
Well, interestingly, if somebody mentioned George Washington before, if you read Washington's farewell address, Washington brought up two major subjects. One is the potential tyranny of the two parties. And the second is that we needed a constitution that could keep adapting to changes, a constitution that would be easy to modify. And we've gotten away from that. Yeah, I think you bring up very good points. I see Bill has had his hand raised for a long time.
Okay, I want to go back, if I can, to something that Stephen Sommerstein said earlier with respect to the competence of the people in these offices and how that seems to grow with age or be more valuable with age. And that may be true, but frankly, I'm not sure competence changes that much as you get older. You may be very competent at any age, but rather I think a more important issue than competence per se, if you're in the office of being a congressperson, you're going to be motivated to do different things, behave different ways if you have an unlimited term where you're going to totally be out of whack or die on the one hand versus knowing you have a term. The motivations are different. If you're in there and you have no term limits, you're going to sit there fat, dumb, and happy and don't rock the boat. You don't want new ideas. You don't want new changes. You want to be there. You're going to be there forever. You're raising the money. You got your friends. You got your seniority. You're really happy and you want to keep it that way. And the people who vote for you, keep voting for you, are familiar with you. You understand them. They're appealing. They're somebody you're more comfortable with. On the other hand, if you have term limits, there's something else you're going to do after you finish the term. You've got another life, potentially, job, opportunity, situation, leadership that you can go on to. And you want to get something done while you're in your period of the term. So you're more willing to make actions and take things going on, cooperate with other people, and not just sit there waiting for the time to come up and live comfortably and nicely and enjoy your privileges. But rather, if you have term limits, different motivations will occur, and that's what we want.
Thank you. Gilly?
Hi, yes. I just wanted to add one point. It's the discussion's been going so well. It's such interesting, different points of view came out. I think that in a perfect world with the perfect, where democracy works perfectly, we can vote whomever out, whether they are incompetent or whether they're too old, not making the right decision. However, the reality is that we're not living in a perfect world. Just thinking about the actual voter turnout, it's like 50%, 60-some%. So not everybody's view is reflected. Plus, for busy folks, they don't even pay attention to what's going on out there. They just vote along the party lines. Do they really pay attention to whether the representatives or the senators is doing this job? And that's why we have a huge incumbent advantage. Yeah. And with that in place, I do think that it's important to have that term limit / whatever limit that, that would help people to really think about making decisions. If not everybody is truly making the right, necessarily the decision that would be good for our entire country, then we need to have some mechanism. I do agree that in a real perfect world, that limit should not exist. Right. But unfortunately, we don't. The reality is that we don't live in a perfect world.
I mean, you have this interesting situation, as I showed in the slides, with 16% approval rate for Congress and 95% reelection rate. And one of the things, going back to Bill's comment, is that as you get seniority, you get much more money. I mean, you can't run against Nancy Pelosi or the Dingles or somebody like that because they'd have so much power lined up behind them from all those years of service that, you know, that even if it was in a competitive district, which it's never going to be, and it's never going to be because the first thing that the politicians make sure is their district is protected. The powerful people district is protected. I see
Tracy Cyrus.
That is actually, her name is Jay, so I don't know why it says Tracy. That's my daughter. And
Okay.
I'm really honored to have my daughter on this call.
Yeah.
Jay, unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I had a question to pose. Do you think that the Republicans are pushing for term limits more so than the Democrats because the youth is overwhelmingly Democratic?
No, I mean, I actually think, you know, the best argument for that is that they may think that all those young people don't vote. Do you vote?
Yes, I do.
Okay. You know, I think Jay Lee had a really good answer to that when she said the Republicans favor small government, and that may be a reason why they're supporting term limits. So I don't think it's because the Democrats are younger. I think it's because the Republicans, you know, want small government, and to the degree that these people are not there forever, you have a chance to weaken Washington.
Yeah, but if there are term limits, then that'd be easier to have more turnover for the Republican Party if the youth is so overwhelmingly Democratic.
I think they would have more turn. I actually think that if they had, I actually think that term limits would have relatively little impact on the balance between the two parties. But I do think one of the things that it would do is it would bring in some candidates who at least understand what TikTok is. You know, now I don't know how many people in this who are in this room are avid, you know, are avid on TikTok. You know, but you know, the idea that one of the big issues in the next Congress is going to be how do you regulate TikTok and social media? And, you know, how many, you know, as I said in the presentation, you know, Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi aren't, you know, posting every day on TikTok, I don't think.
So Stephen Summerstein has another question.
Yes. Am I on right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. By the way, Peter, I don't know if you can get it there.
Yes.
You did your reflection on your other.
Okay.
That's what it looks like, actually. And I don't even have a large photograph in my own office of the Martin Luther King for some odd reason. I have all these marvelous little cards that I hand out to people. Anyway, I'm very much, as I'm listening to everyone here with the debate back and forth, I tend to lean very strongly to term limits as allowing older people to also be able to be in office. One doesn't know how old the person is who is going to be elected. So potentially with term limits, you can still have an older person with a high degree of experience elected to office. It doesn't assume that the person is all going to be on the lower end side. So I tend to favor that as a compromise option compared with setting an age limit, which really has a very little effect on the competence of the individual. On the other hand, I also see that someone like Feinstein or a popular candidate who stays in office indefinitely is not going to easily be removed because people will vote for the person they know rather than the person they don't know. Feinstein would have never been voted out of office, no matter how much you talked about her age or competence. She was popular and she would stay there far beyond her competency. And I don't see any way to eliminate that unless you have term limits. People will vote for what they know rather than for what they don't know. And they're not going to vote her out of office.
No, but I mean, the people will, the question is, I forget, I have to go back to the slide, but you know, you have very fine people, but after 45 or 47 years, you know, can't new blood help you? And most of us are old. I mean, this is not a young group, except for my daughter.
Remember the people who wrote the Constitution and wrote the Federalist Papers. They were all in their 20s and 30s, basically.
Right. I see John with his hand up.
Hello. There are a couple really basic forks in the road that I think are important to be aware of. One is that there's a fundamental difference between whether term limits or age limits are a good idea or would be helpful versus how are term limits or age limits implemented on a federal level, which is a totally different question. I did a little reading prior to the start of this session, and in 1995, citizens of 23 states had passed laws putting term limits on the members of Congress. And in a 1995 Supreme Court case, in a 5-4 split decision, the court decided that citizens are not allowed to term limit their own members of Congress using state laws. Mm-hmm. And quoting from that Supreme Court decision, the court stated that the Constitution prohibits states from imposing congressional qualifications additional to those specifically enumerated in the text of the Constitution. So even though that case was with respect to term limits, it would apply equally to additional requirements or qualifications regarding age limits. And so I think, even though I think a lot of the reasoning that we've been talking about why term limits and age limits are important, it makes total sense. As a practical matter, it seems that with respect to both Supreme Court appointments and with respect to both houses of Congress, the only way to get there is a constitutional amendment.
And my response, I think it's a very good point. And my response, you pointed to the 5-4 decision. My response is based on the current Supreme Court. I do not believe that term limits would be upheld. but I do believe the age limits as they passed in North Dakota would be upheld.
Well, but that's a state court decision, and yeah.
I agree with you. No, what I'm saying is if that went to the Supreme Court, I mean, you just remember Roe v. Wade was overturned. I mean, there've been a lot of decisions that have been made giving in the last, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, the current Supreme Court is much more friendly to laws favoring states' abilities to make decisions. And I would suspect that using the same precedents, and I don't know, I mean, it'll get to the Supreme Court, but I would suspect that listening to the precedents that the Supreme Court could approve the age limit bill as it was passed in in North Dakota. And I see, one of the things that shocked me is we've had this discussion. We have a 92-year-old in the thing who's not said a word, and it looks like he's asleep. Come on, Alan.
Peter, why do you distinguish age from term? The Constitution has neither. Why would a state trying to do that to a federal congressman say? Why would that be different? Why would age limits be different from term limits?
I'm not a lawyer. And no. So when I read some of the documentation around it, what they were basically saying is that, and I'm not going to express this well, but what they were basically saying is that something like a term limit could apply to, the term limit should be something that the houses themselves would set, whereas the age limits were something that the Constitution of an individual state could require.
On a federal level. I'm not talking about state.
No, that's what I'm talking about, on the federal level. In other words,
federal level.
That was the, I mean, I'm not a lawyer and I didn't play one on TV.
It's interesting. It doesn't sound logical to me.
It doesn't sound overly logical to me, but that was the argument that they made in North Dakota for passing the age limits rather than the term limits.
And it passed, did you say?
It passed overwhelmingly.
And it hasn't been challenged, obviously.
And it hasn't yet been challenged. It will be. And
yes,
what's interesting about, going back to some of John's comments, what's interesting about the states that have passed the laws calling for the term limit convention, like in Louisiana, it passed like with 88% of the people of the representatives in the Louisiana House and Senate voted for it. I mean, it was like, I think the vote was 88-11 or some number like that. But it was strongly I could be wrong on the numbers, but it was strongly bipartisan that the states that have voted for constitutional convention have voted for it in a bipartisan way, even though they've all been red states. Silence. Well, does anybody have, we've hit the hour and a half mark. Does anybody have any, this is very, I mean, I thought it was very interesting discussion, and I thank everybody who's participated. Does anybody want to make a final comment?
All right, well, thank you. We'll send out the recording to all attending as well as those who registered and did not attend. So, Stephen,
Thanks.
did you have a final comment?
The last thing I'm thinking about is how uniform do we want our senators and congressmen between all the states? Do we want them all to have the same threshold and requirements between the states? Because some of the things that Peter was bringing up, where states can individually potentially have their own requirements, would make a non-uniform Congress in terms of requirements for office. And I leave that with people to think about.
Well, no, I mean, it's very simple. States can draw congressional districts the way they want. You have two states, Maine and Nebraska, that in the Electoral College vote in the Electoral College by congressional district. That's why you're suddenly seeing all these stories, of what's going on in Omaha, Nebraska, or in Portland, Maine, because those two electoral votes could change the election. And the reality is that this is that to the best of my knowledge, and I may not be the smartest guy in the world, but to the best of my knowledge, in Maine and in Alaska, you have ranked choice voting for the Congress and the Senate. To the best of my knowledge, in California and Washington State, and in Louisiana and Nebraska for state offices only, you have top two nonpartisan primaries. So when Kamala Harris ran against for Senate, she ran against another Democrat of color. The reality is we have a government where states have wide latitude in deciding how they're going to elect their federal officials.
Interesting.
So with that, I thank everybody for coming and look forward to talking to everybody again. Thanks.
Good night.
Goodbye, everyone. Great talk. Bye, Peter.